The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth as Tom McKenna stood on his porch, watching his cattle huddle around what remained of the old watering hole. It was barely a puddle now, brown and murky. The summer of 1923 had been the worst drought Montana had seen in 40 years, and Tom's small ranch was paying the price. He pulled off his worn hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. At 52, Tom had spent his entire life on this land. His grandfather had claimed it back in 1881, and his father had worked it until the day he died. Now it seemed like Tom might be the last McKenna to call this place home. "Tom, come inside," his wife called from the kitchen window. Mary had been by his side for 28 years, through good times and bad. But even she was starting to worry about their future, walking back into their modest farmhouse. Tom could smell the thin soup Mary was making for dinner. They'd been stretching their food supplies for weeks now. The vegetable garden that usually fed them through the summer had withered away, and they'd already sold most of their cattle to pay the bank. "How many head did we lose yesterday?" Mary asked, not looking up from her cooking. "3 more," Tom replied, sinking into his chair at the kitchen table. "That makes 15 this month." Mary's shoulders sagged. Each cow represented money they desperately needed. The bank had already sent 2 notices about their overdue mortgage payments. If they couldn't come up with the money soon, they'd lose everything. Tom remembered when this ranch was thriving. As a boy, he'd helped his father drive hundreds of cattle across these same fields. The creek that ran through their property used to flow year-round, providing fresh water for their livestock and crops. Now it was nothing but a dry ditch filled with sun-baked mud and scattered rocks. "The Hendersons down the road are packing up tomorrow," Mary said quietly. "Frank told me at the general store yesterday. They're moving back east to live with his brother." Tom nodded grimly. The Hendersons were the 3rd family to give up this summer. The drought had pushed many small ranchers to their breaking point. Those who stayed were barely hanging on, hoping and praying for rain that never seemed to come. Later that evening, Tom walked out to check on his remaining cattle. 23 head was all he had left from what had once been a herd of over 200. The animals looked thin and weak, their ribs showing through their dusty coats. He knew he'd probably have to sell more of them soon, but each sale brought him closer to having nothing left. As he made his rounds, Tom thought about his father's words. "Son," the old man had told him, "this land will test you in ways you can't imagine, but if you treat it with respect and treat your neighbors with kindness, it'll take care of you in return." Those words had guided Tom through many difficult times, but now he wondered if his father had ever faced anything this harsh. The land seemed determined to drive him away, and his neighbors were disappearing one by one. Back at the house, Mary was darning socks by lamplight, trying to make their clothes last longer. They couldn't afford to buy new ones, and every penny had to be saved for the mortgage payment. "Maybe we should consider Frank's offer," she said, without looking up. Frank Peterson owned the largest ranch in the county, and he'd offered to buy Tom's land for a fraction of what it was worth. It would be enough to pay off their debts and maybe start over somewhere else, but Tom couldn't bear the thought of giving up his family's legacy. "Not yet," Tom said. "We still have time," Mary smiled sadly. She knew her husband would fight to keep this ranch until his last breath. It was both his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. The next morning brought no relief. The sun rose red and angry, promising another scorching day. Tom checked their well, hoping overnight it might have recovered some water. The bucket came up nearly empty, with just enough muddy water to fill one small pail. He carried the precious water to the house, where Mary would have to decide how to divide it between drinking, cooking, and washing. Every drop had to count now. They'd already stopped watering the few vegetables that remained in their garden, and bathing had become a luxury they could rarely afford. As Tom prepared to ride out and check his cattle, he heard the distant sound of horses approaching. 2 men in suits were riding up the dusty path to his house. Tom's heart sank. He recognized them immediately as representatives from the First National Bank. "Morning, Tom," said the older man as they dismounted. His name was Mr. Whitfield, and he'd been handling the McKenna account for years. "I'm afraid we need to talk." Tom invited them inside, where Mary quickly poured their last bit of coffee into 3 cups. The men sat uncomfortably at the kitchen table, clearly not enjoying their mission. "Tom, you know why we're here?" Mr. Whitfield began. "The bank has been patient, but we're 3 months behind on payments now. The board is pressuring me to foreclose." "I understand your position," Tom replied, "but I just need a little more time. If this drought breaks, I can rebuild the herd and catch up on payments." The younger banker shook his head. "Tom, the weather reports don't show any rain coming for weeks. Even if it starts raining tomorrow, it would take months for the grass to grow back and years to rebuild your herd." Mr. Whitfield leaned forward. "I've known your family for 30 years, and I don't want to do this. But I have to think about the bank's other customers, too. If you can't make a payment by the end of the month, we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." After the bankers left, Tom and Mary sat in silence. The weight of their situation seemed heavier than ever. They had exactly 12 days to come up with 3 months' worth of mortgage payments, and they had no idea where that money would come from. Despite everything, Tom refused to give up hope. That afternoon, he rode out to the far corner of his property, where his grandfather had built the original homestead. The old cabin was falling apart now, but Tom often came here when he needed to think. Sitting on the crumbling porch, he watched the sun begin to set over the parched landscape. Somewhere out there, his ancestors had faced their own challenges and survived. They'd built this ranch from nothing, working from dawn to dusk, believing in a future they might never see themselves. As darkness fell, Tom made a silent promise to his father's memory. He would find a way to save this ranch, no matter what it took. He didn't know how, but he refused to be the McKenna who let the family legacy slip away. Little did he know that in just a few days, his entire world would change in ways he could never have imagined. 3 days had passed since the bank's visit, and Tom McKenna was running out of options. The morning air was already hot at sunrise, promising another brutal day under the merciless Montana sun. He barely slept, his mind racing through impossible calculations, trying to figure out how to save his ranch. Mary had packed him a small lunch, though their food supplies were getting dangerously low. A piece of hard bread, some dried meat, and a small jar of water was all they could spare. Every bite counted now, and every sip of water was precious. Tom saddled his horse, an old Mari named Belle, who'd been with the family for over a decade. She was getting thin too, her ribs showing through her dusty coat, but she was still reliable. As he rode out to check the fence line along what used to be Willow Creek, Tom couldn't help but remember better times when this same path was lined with green grass and the sound of flowing water. The creek bed was completely dry now, just a winding scar across the landscape filled with cracked mud and scattered stones. Tom had been putting off this particular section of fence repair because it reminded him too much of what his ranch used to be. But with cattle going missing and neighbors desperate enough to let their animals wander onto other people's land, he couldn't ignore it any longer. As he rode along the old creek bed, something caught his eye near a cluster of dead cottonwood trees. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as he got closer, his heart jumped. It was a person lying motionless in the shade of the largest tree. Tom quickly dismounted and rushed over. It was a young man, probably in his 20s, with long black hair and dark skin that marked him as one of the local Native Americans. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and Tom could see a serious wound in his shoulder that looked infected and swollen. The man's lips were cracked and white from dehydration, and his breathing was shallow and weak. Tom had seen enough injured animals to know this person was close to death. Without water and medical attention soon, he wouldn't make it through another day in this heat. Tom gently shook the man's uninjured shoulder. "Hey there, can you hear me?" The young man's eyes fluttered, open, unfocused, and filled with pain. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. Tom couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the desperation in the voice. "Easy now," Tom said, reaching for his water jar. "Don't try to talk, you need water first." He carefully lifted the man's head and brought the jar to his lips. The stranger drank greedily, water running down his chin as he tried to take in as much as possible. Tom had to pull the jar away to make sure the man didn't drink too fast and make himself sick. "Slow down there," Tom said gently. "There's more where that came from." After a few minutes, the man seemed a bit stronger. He looked up at Tom with confused but grateful eyes and managed to whisper a few words in broken English. Double quotes. "Help. They shot me." Tom's mind raced. He'd heard stories about conflicts between local authorities and Native Americans in the area. Some tribal members had been accused of cattle rustling, and tensions had been running high for months. Whether this man was guilty of anything or not, Tom could see he was hurt and needed help, but helping him wouldn't be simple. If this man was wanted by the law, Tom could get in serious trouble for harboring him. With the bank already breathing down his neck and his ranch on the verge of foreclosure, getting arrested would be the final nail in the coffin. Tom looked down at the injured stranger and thought about his father's words about treating others with kindness. He thought about how desperate he'd been feeling just hours ago, wishing someone would throw him a lifeline. Here was another human being, possibly dying, asking for the same kind of help Tom wished he could get. The decision took less than a heartbeat. "All right, friend," Tom said, carefully examining the shoulder wound. "This looks pretty bad, but I think we can fix you up. My wife Mary knows about doctoring. She'd take good care of you." The man's eyes widened with surprise and relief. Most white settlers in the area wouldn't even speak to Native Americans, let alone help them. But here was this stranger, risking his own safety to save someone he'd never met before. Getting the injured man onto Bell was a challenge. The shoulder wound made it impossible for him to climb up on his own, and Tom had to be careful not to cause more damage. After several attempts, they managed to get him seated behind Tom. Holding on with his good arm, the ride back to the farmhouse took twice as long as usual. Tom had to stop frequently to make sure his passenger wasn't going to fall off, and the heat was getting worse by the hour. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words in his native language that Tom couldn't understand. When they finally reached the house, Mary came running out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face showed surprise and concern as she saw the injured stranger. "Tom, what happened?" "Who is this?" "Found him by the old creek bed," Tom explained as he helped the man down from the horse. "He's been shot, and he's in pretty bad shape. Looks like he's been out there for days." Mary didn't hesitate. Despite their own desperate situation, despite not knowing anything about this person or how he'd gotten hurt, she immediately went into action. "Bring him inside," she said, already planning what needed to be done. "I'll heat some water and get my medical supplies." They managed to get the stranger into their spare bedroom, a small room they'd once hoped to use for the children they never had. Tom helped him onto the bed while Mary gathered everything she needed. As Mary began cleaning the wound, the man opened his eyes and looked directly at Tom. Despite the pain he was obviously feeling, he managed to speak clearly for the first time. "My name ... Running Wolf," he said in careful English. You saved my life?" Tom nodded. "I'm Tom McKenna, and this is my wife Mary. Don't worry about anything right now except getting better." Running Wolf tried to say something else, but Mary shushed him gently. "No talking until I get this cleaned up properly," she said with the firm but kind tone she'd used on injured animals throughout her life. As Mary worked on treating the infected wound, Tom couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. He'd acted on instinct, the same way he would have helped any injured creature. But this decision could have consequences he hadn't fully considered. Still, looking at Running Wolf's grateful eyes and seeing how carefully Mary tended to his injuries, Tom knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe, and this was definitely one of those times. The first night was the hardest. Running Wolf's fever spiked dangerously high, and Mary spent hours applying cool, damp cloths to his forehead while Tom held him steady during moments when he thrashed around in delirium. Their precious water supply, already critically low, was being used to keep a stranger alive. Tom sat in a chair beside the bed, watching Mary work with the skill of someone who'd spent years caring for sick animals and people alike. She'd cleaned the infected wound, as best she could with their limited supplies, using up their last bottle of rubbing alcohol and most of their clean bandages. "The infection's pretty deep," Mary whispered during one of Running Volf's quieter moments. "He needs real medicine, the kind Doc Peterson keeps in town." Tom knew what she meant. Dr. Peterson had sulfur powder and other medicines that could fight infection, but buying them would cost money they didn't have. The doctor might also ask questions about how Running Volf got hurt, questions that could lead to trouble for all of them. "We'll make do with what we have," Tom said quietly. "Your grandmother's remedies worked for years before there were fancy medicines." Mary nodded and went to the kitchen to brew a tea from willow bark, something her grandmother had taught her could help with fever and pain. As she worked, Tom stayed with Running Volf, occasionally giving him small sips of water and watching for any changes in his condition. By the second day, Running Volf was awake more often, though still very weak. He tried to refuse the water and food Tom offered, pointing to himself and shaking his head. It took Tom a while to understand that Running Volf was worried about taking resources from a family that clearly had very little. "You drink," Tom insisted, holding the water jar closer. "You eat. That's not up for discussion." Running Volf looked confused by this kindness. In his fevered state, he sometimes spoke in his native language, and Tom could hear the pain and worry in his voice even without understanding the words. During clearer moments, Running Volf would try to tell Tom what had happened to him. They said ... "We steal cattle," Running Volf managed to explain in his careful English. "My people ... We hunt on old lands. Soldiers come. Shooting starts, I run, but bullet." He touched his wounded shoulder gently. Tom listened without judgment. He'd heard stories about misunderstandings between the local tribes and white settlers, conflicts that often started with assumptions and fear rather than facts. Whether Running Volf's people had actually taken any cattle or not, Tom could see this young man was no threat to anyone in his current condition. Mary brought a bowl of their thin soup to the room. It was mostly broth with a few pieces of vegetables, but it was warm and nourishing. She sat on the edge of the bed and carefully helped Running Volf eat, one spoonful at a time. "He needs real food to get his strength back," she told Tom later when they were alone in the kitchen. "Meat, eggs, milk, things we don't have much of anymore." Tom made a decision that surprised even himself. The next morning he rode to the general store in town and used the last of their emergency money to buy eggs, fresh milk, and a small piece of beef. It was money they'd been saving for the mortgage payment, but Tom couldn't watch someone suffer when he had the power to help. The store owner, Mr. Jenkins, raised an eyebrow at Tom's purchases. "Mighty fancy eating for someone who hasn't paid his account in 2 months, he commented. "Family emergency," Tom replied simply, not offering any details. When Tom returned home with the food, Mary's eyes filled with tears. She knew exactly what he'd sacrificed to make these purchases, and she loved him even more for it. "You're a good man, Tom McKenna," she said, kissing his cheek. "Sometimes too good for your own good, but good all the same." Running Volf's recovery was slow but steady. By the third day, the fever had broken, and he could sit up on his own. Mary had been changing his bandages twice a day, and the infection was finally starting to clear up. The young man was amazed by the care he was receiving from these strangers. "Why? You help me?" he asked Tom during one of their conversations. "Your people and my people ... we not friends." Tom thought about the question for a long moment. "I guess I don't see it that way," he finally said. "I see a hurt person who needed help, that's all." Running Volf nodded slowly, as if trying to understand this different way of thinking. He'd grown up hearing stories about white settlers who took land and gave nothing back, people who saw Native Americans as enemies to be feared or driven away. But here were Tom and Mary, sharing their last resources with someone they had every reason to distrust. "My grandmother," Running Volf said, "she tells stories about the old times, before the fighting. She say there were good people on both sides, people who wanted to live in peace." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Tom replied as Running Volf grew stronger. He insisted on helping around the house despite his injured shoulder. He couldn't do heavy work, but he helped Mary with cooking and tried to make himself useful in small ways. His presence in their home felt natural, as if he'd always been part of their family. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing another simple meal, Running Wolf surprised them both by speaking about his life. He told them about his family, his sister who was expecting her first child, and his father who led their small band of people. He spoke about the old ways of life that were disappearing and the fear his people felt about the future. "We no want trouble," Running Wolf explained. "We just want to live, to feed our families. But white man's law says we cannot hunt where our fathers hunted." Tom listened carefully, beginning to understand the impossible situation Running Wolf's people faced. They were caught between their traditional way of life and new laws that made that life illegal. It was a kind of desperation Tom was starting to understand himself. The feeling of having everything you've known threatened by forces beyond your control. On the fourth night, Tom woke to find Running Wolf standing by the window, looking out at the starlit sky. His shoulder was still bandaged, but he moved with more strength than he'd had since Tom found him. "You feel well enough to travel?" Tom asked softly. Running Wolf turned and nodded. "Tomorrow, I think. My people, they worry about me." "They not know what happened." Tom felt a strange sadness at the thought of Running Wolf leaving. In just a few days, this young man had become like family to them. His presence had brought something unexpected into their struggling home, a sense of purpose beyond their own problems. "You sure you're ready?" Mary asked from the doorway. She'd been listening to their conversation. "That shoulder needs more time to heal properly." "I strong enough," Running Wolf assured her. "And you give too much already." "I take your food, your medicine, your water. You need these things for yourselves." The next morning came too quickly. Mary packed what little food they could spare for Running Wolf's journey, and Tom gave him one of his own shirts to replace the torn and blood-stained one he'd been wearing. As Running Wolf prepared to leave, he reached into a small pouch he wore around his neck and pulled out a smooth carved stone. It was about the size of a silver dollar, with intricate symbols etched into its surface. "This belonged to my grandfather," Running Wolf said, pressing the stone into Tom's palm. He said, "Bring protection and good fortune to those who show kindness to strangers." Tom tried to refuse the gift, but Running Wolf closed Tom's fingers around the stone firmly. "You saved my life. My people, they will know this. They will remember." With those words, Running Wolf disappeared into the early morning mist, leaving Tom and Mary standing on their porch with a small carved stone and the memory of an extraordinary few days that had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Tom woke before sunrise the next morning, as he had every day for the past 30 years. But something felt different. The air seemed to vibrate with an energy he couldn't explain, and Belle was restless in the small corral, pacing and snorting. Nervously, he pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch, expecting to see the same empty landscape that had greeted him every morning since the drought began. Instead, he froze in complete shock. The sight before him was so extraordinary that he had to blink several times to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Spread across his property, as far as he could see, were people, hundreds of them. Native Americans from what appeared to be multiple tribes, with their horses, travois, and temporary shelters dotting his fields like a vast, colorful tapestry. Smoke from dozens of small cooking fires drifted across the morning air, and the sound of voices speaking in various native languages created a gentle hum that seemed to make the land itself come alive. "Mary," Tom called softly, not wanting to take his eyes off the incredible scene. "Mary, you need to see this." His wife appeared beside him, still in her nightgown with a shawl thrown over her shoulders. When she saw what had gathered on their land, she gasped and grabbed Tom's arm. "Oh, my lord," she whispered. "Tom, what's happening? Are we in danger?" Before Tom could answer, he spotted a familiar figure walking toward them through the crowd. Running Wolf approached with a confident stride, his wounded shoulder obviously much better, though he still moved carefully. But he wasn't alone. Walking beside him were several older men wearing elaborate headdresses and traditional clothing that marked them as tribal leaders. Tom's heart pounded as the group drew closer. He still had Running Wolf's carved stone in his pocket, and he touched it, now drawing some strange comfort from its smooth surface. Whatever was about to happen, he'd face it with the same honesty that had guided his decision to help a wounded stranger. "Tom McKenna," Running Wolf called out when he was still 20 yards away. His voice carried clearly across the morning. I have returned as I promised I would." The group stopped a respectful distance from the porch. Tom could see now that there were 7 distinct groups represented, each with their own leaders and distinctive styles of dress and decoration. Some he recognized as Blackfoot, like Running Wolf, but others wore the clothing and symbols of tribes he'd only heard about in stories. An elderly man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes stepped forward. He wore a magnificent headdress, made of eagle feathers, and carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to leading others. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "I am Chief White Eagle of the Blackfoot Nation," he said, looking directly at Tom. "This young man has told us a story that brought us here from many days' travel away." Tom found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Chief White Eagle, you and your people are welcome here, but I'm not sure I understand." Running Wolf stepped forward and began to speak, but not in English. He addressed the assembled leaders in what Tom assumed was Blackfoot, his voice strong and passionate. Though Tom couldn't understand the words, he could hear the emotion behind them. Running Wolf gestured toward Tom and Mary several times, and Tom began to realize that he was telling the story of the past few days. When Running Wolf finished speaking, another leader stepped forward. This man was younger, perhaps 40, with scars on his face that spoke of many battles. His clothing identified him as Crow, traditionally enemies of the Blackfoot, yet here he stood alongside Chief White Eagle. "I am Joseph Standing Bear of the Crow people," he announced. "When Running Wolf came to our camp last night and told us what you did, our council decided we must see this white man who risks everything to save a stranger." A third leader, this one from the Cheyenne tribe based on his distinctive beadwork, nodded in agreement. "I am Robert Two Hawks. In 30 years of dealing with white settlers, I have never heard such a story. We had to come and see if it was true." Tom was beginning to understand that Running Wolf had spent the entire night traveling from camp to camp, telling different tribes about what had happened. But he still didn't understand why they were all here. "Running Wolf told you I helped him," Tom said slowly. "That's true. But any decent person would have done the same thing." Chief White Eagle shook his head. "You are wrong, Tom McKenna. Many white men would have left him to die. Others would have turned him over to the soldiers. For the reward money, you did neither. You shared your water when you had little. You gave your food when you were hungry. You spent your money when you had none to spare." Mary squeezed Tom's arm tighter. She was beginning to realize that Running Wolf had told them everything, including details about their desperate financial situation. "You see, Chief White Eagle," continued, "Running Wolf is not just any young man. He is my grandson, the only son of my daughter, who died giving birth to him. He is precious to me beyond words." Tom felt his knees go weak. He'd saved the grandson of a powerful chief without knowing it. The implications of this were staggering. Running Wolf stepped forward again, this time speaking in English so Tom and Mary could understand. "Grandfather, this is the man who saved my life. Tom McKenna and his wife Mary, they are good people, they have honor." Chief White Eagle nodded solemnly. "When Running Wolf told us what you did, I sent messengers to the other tribes. We have been enemies for generations, but we all agreed on one thing. A debt of honor must be repaid." "That's not necessary," Tom began, but Joseph Standing Bear held up his hand. "Tom McKenna, you do not understand. By saving Running Wolf, you have done something that goes beyond the actions of one person helping another. You have shown us that not all white men are our enemies. You have proven that honor and kindness can exist between our peoples." Robert Two Hawks spoke next. "We have spent years fighting each other over land, over hunting rights, over old grievances. But your actions remind us that there are more important things than these conflicts." Chief White Eagle looked around at the assembled tribes, then back at Tom. 7 tribes have come here today. 7 tribes that rarely speak to each other, much less work together. But Running Wolf's story brought us together in a way that nothing else has in my lifetime. Tom was overwhelmed by what he was hearing. He'd simply done what felt right, what his father had taught him about treating others with kindness. He'd never imagined it would lead to something like this. "We know about your troubles," Chief White Eagle continued. "Running Wolf told us about the drought, about your debts, about the men from the bank. We have come here not just to thank you, but to help you as you helped him." Mary finally found her voice. "Help us how?" Running Wolf smiled, the first truly happy expression Tom had seen on his face since finding him by the creek. "My people, all our peoples, we know this land. We know where the water is, where the grass grows even in drought, how to make the earth give life when others think it is dead." Joseph Standing Bear nodded. "We have knowledge that your people do not have. We have resources you need. And now, because of what you did, we have trust." As the morning sun climbed higher, Tom realized that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The carved stone in his pocket seemed to grow warm against his fingers as if it were somehow connected to the extraordinary events unfolding before him. What happened next seemed like something out of a dream. Chief White Eagle raised his hand and the entire gathering fell silent. Hundreds of people stopped what they were doing and turned their attention to the small group standing near Tom's modest farmhouse. "Bring the gifts," the chief called out in English, then repeated the command in his native language. Tom watched in amazement as people began moving toward them from all directions. They carried bundles, led horses, and pulled travois loaded with items he couldn't yet identify. The procession seemed endless, with representatives from each of the 7 tribes bringing different offerings. The first group to arrive was led by Running Wolf's father, a man named Black Hawk who looked like an older version of his son. He carried a leather pouch that seemed heavy for its size. "Tom McKenna," Black Hawk said, his English accented but clear. "My son lives because of you. This is from our winter stores." He opened the pouch to reveal dozens of gold coins, more money than Tom had seen in years. Tom's eyes widened. "I can't accept this. I didn't help Running Wolf for money." "We know," Chief White Eagle replied. "That is exactly why you deserve it. But money is only the beginning." The next group brought horses. Not just any horses, but magnificent animals that were clearly bred for both strength and endurance. Joseph Standing Bear gestured to a beautiful black stallion that pranced nervously at the end of a rope. "This is Thunder Runner," he announced. "He is the fastest horse in our herd, and his offspring will be even faster. We give him to you, along with 6 mares. Your cattle operation may have failed, but horse breeding can make you wealthy beyond your dreams." Tom ran his hand along Thunder Runner's neck, feeling the power in the animal's muscles. He'd always been good with horses, and he knew quality when he saw it. These animals were worth more than his entire ranch, but the gifts kept coming. Robert Two Hawks approached with a group of young men carrying what looked like farming tools, but unlike any Tom had ever seen. "These are special plows," Robert explained, "designed by my people for farming in dry land. They cut deeper, hold moisture better, and can work soil that normal plows cannot touch." A woman from the Cheyenne tribe, introduced as Running Wolf's aunt, brought seeds in beautifully woven baskets. "These are ancient varieties," she explained through an interpreter. "Corn, beans, and squash that grow with little water. My grandmother's grandmother grew these same plants when the white man first came to this land." But perhaps the most valuable gift came from an unexpected source. An elderly Crow medicine man approached Tom with a gnarled walking stick and eyes that seemed to see everything. "I am Wise Owl," he said simply. "I know water." For the next hour, Wise Owl walked Tom's property with a concentration that was almost spiritual. He stopped at various points, knelt to touch the soil, and listened to sounds that only he could hear. Finally, he led Tom to a spot about 200 yards from the house, near where the old creek used to flow strongest. "Dig here," Wise Owl sighed, pointing to a seemingly random patch of ground. "Dig deep. The water spirits still live beneath this place." Tom looked skeptical. He'd lived on this land his entire life and thought he knew every inch of it, but Chief White Eagle nodded seriously. Wise Owl has found water in places where others have given up hope, the chief explained. His gift is real. Within hours, Tom found himself watching as dozens of tribal members worked together to dig a well exactly where Wise Owl had indicated. They worked in shifts, using tools both traditional and modern, going deeper than Tom would have thought possible. As the day wore on, more gifts and knowledge were shared. A group of Blackfoot women showed merry techniques for preserving food that could last through the harshest winters. Cheyenne hunters demonstrated how to track game in ways that white settlers had never learned. Crow warriors shared knowledge about weather patterns that could help predict when rains would come, but it wasn't just practical help they offered. Tom began to understand that he was being invited into something much larger than a simple exchange of favors. He was being welcomed into a network of relationships that stretched across hundreds of miles and involved thousands of people. We trade with towns as far as Colorado and Wyoming, Joseph Standing Bear explained as they sat around a fire that evening. Horses, furs, crafted goods. White merchants pay good money for authentic tribal items, and they always need reliable horses, Chief White Eagle added, but more than trade, you are now family. When one of our people needs help, others provide it. When someone has plenty, they share with those who have little. This is our way. Tom was beginning to see the full scope of what was being offered to him. It wasn't just material wealth, though that was certainly part of it. He was being brought into a community that spanned multiple tribes and operated on principles of mutual support and shared prosperity. On the third day, Wise Owl's prediction proved correct. The diggers struck water at nearly 30 feet, and it bubbled up clear and cold, more abundant than Tom's original well had ever been. The cheer that went up from the crowd could be heard for miles. The spirits approve, Wise Owl said with satisfaction. This water will never run dry, even in the worst drought. As word of the successful well spread through the gathered tribes, Tom realized that his reputation was spreading too. He wasn't just the white man who had helped Running Wolf anymore. He was becoming known as someone who could be trusted, someone worth doing business with. Over the following days, a steady stream of visitors arrived at Tom's ranch. Word had spread to other tribes, to trading posts, and even to white merchants who were curious about this new partnership between a struggling rancher and multiple Native American tribes. The transformation was remarkable. Within a week, Tom's property went from a failing ranch to the hub of a growing trade network. The horses alone were worth more than his original debt, but the ongoing business opportunities were even more valuable. Mary could hardly believe the change. Their pantry was full for the first time in months, their debts were paid, and they had more opportunities for the future than they knew what to do with. It's like a miracle, she told Tom one evening as they watched the sunset over their revitalized land. No, Tom replied, touching the carved stone in his pocket that had become his constant companion. It's just what happens when people treat each other right. The bank representatives who returned a week later were stunned to find not a foreclosure, but a thriving operation with cash to spare. Mr. Whitfield could barely hide his amazement as Tom counted out the full amount owed, plus interest. How did you manage this? The banker asked. Tom smiled and gestured toward the bustling activity around his property. I learned that sometimes the best investment you can make is in other people. Running Wolf, who had stayed to help coordinate the new partnerships, clasped Tom's shoulder with his good arm. My grandfather says you have an old soul, Tom McKenna. You understand what many people never learn. What's that? Tom asked. That kindness is not weakness. That helping others helps yourself. That the best way to receive good fortune is to give it away freely. As the months passed, Tom's ranch became legendary throughout Montana. Stories spread of the white rancher who had united 7 tribes through a single act of compassion, who had turned a failing farm into a successful trading hub, and who proved that people of different backgrounds could work together for everyone's benefit. The carved stone that Running Wolf had given him remained Tom's most treasured possession. Not because of any magical properties, but because of what it represented. It was a reminder that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or land or weapons, but the simple decision to help someone in need. And whenever young people asked Tom for advice about life, he would pull out that smooth stone and tell them the story of how everything changed the day he chose compassion over fear, generosity over selfishness, and hope over despair.